I'm Mitch Gallagher. Welcome to GearFest 2017. Our guest in the video studio is Chuck Ainlay. Good to see you, man.
Going?
Shake your hand.
You too, buddy. Yeah.
Nashville engineer, producer, multiple Grammy nominee, Grammy for the surround mix of Brothers in Arms for Dire Straits.
Yeah.
Engineer of the Year.
Oh, a bunch of those.
Something like the you were an award for the most top 10 hits by an engineer, I think, too, in a single year.
Yeah. Well, they used to call it the NAMMYs. Yeah. And I think they stopped doing it because it was too close to the Grammys. But it was a Nashville Music Association award, and
okay.
So they would. It was like besides the Grammy award, there was really not an engineer award, you know. So it was kind of an honor to get it, you know.
Yeah,
and
sure.
You know, so those engineering Grammys that I've won, you know, are really important to me. It's not, you know, there's the only way that somebody can actually say, hey, you've done a good job, you know.
Right. Well, so. the fact that they listen to your record so much and hold them in such high esteem is hopefully some high praise as well.
It's true. I mean, every now and then I'll get an email from somebody saying, you know, records mean a lot to me, or I really appreciate what you do, and
that's awesome.
It's amazing, you know, get that
absolutely.
feedback, because you know much of what we do, we're sitting alone by ourselves in a room turning knobs, you know.
Right.
So you know, to get that feedback's really cool.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. Well, congratulations on all that success in your long career. The credits are just absolutely astounding. I can only go through a few, but you know, MarkKnopfler, obviously, and Dire Straits, and Vince Gill, and Dixie Chicks, and the list goes on. I'm not George Strait. We were talking about a little bit earlier. And, just an incredible list of credits you have.
You know, part of it's luck, you know, and then the other part of it, I think, is just being prepared when you get the call, you know, to be able to jump in and do it. And I mean, I've always said yes. If somebody asked me, could I do something, I'll figure out how to do it, you know. But first off, I said yes. And like I say, having the tools, you know, being prepared is like the main thing, so that when you do jump in, you know, you kind of don't screw it up.
Right.
Yeah.
So talking about that preparation, you went to the Indiana University School of Music for a while, right?
Yeah, you know, out of high school, you know, my parents wanted us kids. I have 2 brothers and 2 sisters, and they'd always said, you know, we want you to go to college, get a proper education, you know, really benefit, and you know, as you get older. And yeah, I was into music, you know. I was like, what do I need a college degree for? But I went off to IU and took, you know, theory and guitar, and you know, it's mostly music and sort of some other interesting courses. I remember I really got into folklore, and I thought, you know, maybe what I would be is a field recordist. I really had kind of that idea in mind, that I'd go like record tribal ceremonies and things like that.
Right.
But there was a studio there in Bloomington called Guilfoyle Sound Studios, and they offered a sort of a program, you know, and I went through that, and I was like, I got out of that, and I was like, yeah, this is definitely what I want to do. I don't see any point wasting time in college. So I went back home, the little town near here, Goshen, Indiana, is where I grew up. And that summer, and I was just going to get back in a band, start working in a factory or something, you know, and kind of figure out how I was going to get into being an engineer. And someone came into my dad's office and told him that their son was going to go to Nashville to a school called Belmont, that they had just started a music business program, and they had a studio. I said, studio, let's go check it out. So we drove down to Nashville, and they had a little studio, a little 8-track Ampex machine with a Langevin desk, and it still was a studio. I don't care, you know. I was like, okay, let's do this. So while I was there, we upgraded the studio. We put in a 16-track machine and an MCI console, and you know, kind of built some booths, and we got a Yamaha piano. I mean, it was a nice little facility, but there wasn't really that many people that knew how to run it, except for me, because I'd had some experience. And so, I mean, I was in that room engineering the classes. I was at night doing stuff with students, and obviously it wasn't really great for my studies.
Right.
So I dropped out. I got a job in a little tourist studio. It was kind of my first real engineering job, and that led me to someone looking for a chief engineer for a studio in Fort Wayne, Indiana. brought me here
How
for
about that?
for a little while before I decided to go back to Nashville.
Huh, I didn't know that. That's awesome.
Yeah, it's
That's
wild.
awesome.
I got a little history here.
Yeah, right, right. So I read a quote from around that time, someone talking about that time, and you saying that even when you started, your sights were firmly set on having a career in the music industry, and you were very driven in that direction.
Yeah, I mean, even in high school, you know, I had bought a Tandberg 2-track, and my buddy had a TAC 4-track, and we built a little studio in his basement. And I remember, you know, it was that time when you got to go speak to the guidance counselor and, like, you know, discuss your future. And I went in there and I said, you know, I want to be a recording engineer. And of course, they knew nothing about what that was.
Right.
And I mean, I just, that's what I wanted to do even then. And yeah, there's nothing going to stop me. And it's always been what I wanted to do. I mean, I wanted to produce records too, but, you know, I mean, my real passion was engineering. Yeah.
Right, right. That's so cool.
Yeah.
That's so cool. So tell us a little bit about how your career developed. You moved on to Music Row and you were an assistant, but you ended up chief engineer, and Jimmy Bowen was kind of involved.
Yeah, I'm working out of this studio called Sound Lab, and we also built a remote truck and it had a house, and that was called the Rock House. The studio, Sound Lab, we were doing records with Dr. Hook and Helen Reddy under the chief engineer Jim Cotton. But Jim Cotton he's now passed away sadly, but he was more of a vibe master, you know, he and a soul man, you know, I mean, that was his deal. But he let me and there was another second engineer, and I call us second engineers because we didn't really assist back then, you know. It was, you didn't have automation, so when you were mixing, everybody was on the console. There'd be like 4 or 5 of us on the consoles, you know, somebody grabbing switches, somebody turning knobs.
Right.
It was fun. And so if you had the budget, you get the chief engineer. If you didn't have the budget, you get the second engineer. So I got to do a lot of engineering. And Jim would, you know, kind of have us get drum sounds and all that, and he'd kind of sit down at the console and then kind of take over and run the session. So it got a lot of experience that way, and the remote truck was, man, that was a lot of work. But we got to do, like, record The Police, you know, right about the time Roxanne had come out. So it was like the heyday of punk, and but we also got to record Journey, and then in the house there, we'd do like just endless demos with people. It was also sort of there was a lot of drugs floating around, so 3 days in a row was not uncommon, you know, kind of thing. So. Fortunately, those days are over. But then I got asked to go out and do some demos at a place called the Castle. It was a sort of a rural studio, but beautiful place. And while I was there, they were so impressed with my work. They said, "Look, you know, we're looking to change the chief engineer situation here. Would you be interested?" I said, "Yeah." So. Through that situation, there was a famous producer from Nashville, Jimmy Bowen. He came out to use the studio, and while he was there, he was struggling with the person he was using to mix. It was a Conway Twitty album, and there was like 3 days in a row he didn't feel as though they had the mix, so I was kind of assisting as I would when I wasn't engineering. And he goes, "You mixed that Deborah Allen record, didn't you?" And I said, "Yeah." And he said, "Man, I love that record. Why don't you sit down?" So I sat down and ended up mixing that album, and shortly thereafter I got a call from the production coordinator for Jimmy. He said, "Jimmy wants you to start working for him, and whatever you charge, you're going to now charge twice that." So I go, "Okay, I'll see you later," at the Castle, and I started working for Bowen, and that kind of led me to working with Tony Brown, who basically replaced Jimmy Bowen as the head of A&R. He was like the president there at MCA Records, and Tony's track record stands for itself. Many of the records that I've, you know, got accolades for were working for Tony. You know, yeah, and then you mentioned working with MarkKnopfler. That was just kind of a odd call out of the blue. You know, his manager called me, asked me to come work for him while doing a Dire Straits record. And I thought it was a prank call, so I hung up on them. And
Right.
fortunately, they called back the next day, and I was off on a flight to London to work at Air Studios on the, it was essentially the next to last Dire Straits album, the On Every Street album, and then we did a live album after that.
Mm-hmm.
And during all that, Mark and I had a lot of conversations about making records, and so when he started his solo career after that, he called me up to produce and engineer his records. So we've had close to 30-year relationship.
Yeah, it's wonderful.
It's been pretty awesome.
Incredible music, incredible albums have come out of that.
You know, for me, Nashville can kind of be sort of a factory. You know, the musicianship is unparalleled. The studio quality there is amazing, and great artists and everything. But it can kind of be like formula, and everybody's expecting radio records.
Mm-hmm.
So working for Mark was always sort of, you know, it was a totally different thing. He didn't care if it was a single. He just wanted to create great music. And I think it really helped shape how I look at making records. You know, I'm not so, you know, of course I'd love to have a hit record and I want that for my artists, but I mean, I believe, as Mark did, that you have hit records because you make great music.
Mm-hmm. Right, right. So talk a little bit about how, on the producer side of things, you work with an artist who's already established, like Mark. Are you in there saying, "Do this, Mister, let's get this," or are you taking a little different?
You know,
approach than that?
everybody's different,
Sure.
and you have to kind of basically find out what your role is going to be as a producer. But essentially, what a producer is somebody who helps keep the artist on track, and you know, when they start diving into like areas where it's not really going to help them, that you kind of pull them back in, rein them in. An artist like MarkKnopfler, he's such an incredible musician and songwriter, and understands who his audience is like nobody else. I mean, I could maybe say George Strait is like parallel to that, you know, where they understand what their target audience is, and they kind of stay on a path. And so, you know, for me working with Mark, it's more like facilitating the recording and
Sure.
Being the person on the other side of the glass who's listening to the performance, because he's performing as we're tracking, you know. I mean, he's having to, like, you know, keep focused on the performance.
Right.
He's directing things, though. I mean, it's amazing to see him, you know, kind of shape what everybody's part is. And I think he, like, developed that from Dire Straits, because I'm not putting anybody down in Dire Straits back then, but he was the consummate musician and basically told what everybody was to play, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's, you know, when we started doing solo albums, he said, you know, the thing I want to have at my disposal is like really amazing musicianships, something that I haven't had my entire career. And so that's what we put together, these like incredible players, and yet though he's like in there, he's like analyzing what everybody's doing. I mean, he sees the relationship of a bass note against the chord in the piano and how it maybe could be something else, you know, and really shapes those things. It's incredible.
Right. So are you tracking those sessions, or did you track the sessions for the solo albums? Is it everybody playing at once, or are you doing them one at a time?
We've done lots of different ways. Early on, it was like everybody playing at once, and Mark would come to Nashville, and we'd record like as a band. I think he was enjoying the process of recording with great musicians as much as making a record, you know. I mean, it was just the fact that he was in this room with these incredible players,
right,
and you know, being able to like craft his songs in a way that he couldn't have done before. But then as time went on, we got talking about building a studio, and so he he ended up building probably, in my opinion, one of the best studios in the world. It's called British Grove. It's available for, if somebody wants to rent it, but it's ridiculous. I mean, the acoustics, the technology in the room, the people, the vibe. I mean, everything about it, including the fact that 2 blocks down the road is the Fuller's Brewery, where they make London Pride. So,
right.
Cheers. At any rate, that when we started working in there, he, obviously it's expensive to take me to England and have me there the whole time. And his keyboard player, Guy Fletcher, actually started out as an engineer. His dad was Ted Fletcher, who designed all the Meek equipment for Joe Meek, and then came out with the Joe Meek gear. He designed consoles like the Silk digital. It was the first digitally controlled analog desk, I think. He had a real technical background and an engineering background, and so he's would like kind of sit in the studio with Mark, being a keyboard player, program tracks and all, and then he would bring me and the band over, or Mark would bring me and the band over, and we would kind of either build on top of those tracks, keep maybe his vocal and guitar, or maybe scratch everything and just use it as a template for making the record. And so it was kind of a variety of things in making his record.
Right.
And then this most recent record I wasn't involved in. Guy did that with Mark entirely, and it was all built from programming, and then they did overdub bass and drums to that. So
okay, right. Those Sailing to Philadelphia, Golden Heart, Rag Picker, all those are the sonics on those albums are spectacular. I mean, they really are reference quality recordings. Talk a little bit about how you approach that. Are you close miking everything? Are you trying to get room in there? Do you allow for bleed? Do you not allow for bleed? What are the tracking sessions like?
Well, I do both. I mean, I really like bleed. I mean, I think bleed is part of the way that you get dimensionality in a recording. If everything's close mic'd and sterile, even with putting delays and reverbs and things, it still doesn't have that interesting three-dimensional depth that when you have room mics open or drum mics picking up guitars, or the bleed, it just makes it like everything kind of pull together. In designing Mark's studio, we actually built it to where the studio is a large space in and of itself, but then we have booths all along 2 sides of it, and then a corner booth that are on rolling doors that you can basically open those booths entirely up, and they become part of the main room, or you can close them off and you get really good isolation the way these doors are manufactured. Or you can open them up partially and allow bleed, like the guitars to get into the drums and stuff, but it's controlled bleed. And actually when I redid my studio at Soundstage in Nashville, I did the same kind of idea, where we have the door we can separate, or the wall where we can separate spaces, or we can open the door and let it bleed. And I love that, I mean,
right.
And I use a fair amount of room mics. I use a lot of compression generally on the room mics to kind of liven up the room. I mean, if you listen to the solo of the room mics, they kind of sound rude almost, because I'll even go like full-on distortion to kind of get the room to really like get crazy if that's what I'm looking for.
Right.
But saying all that, I do like a lot of close miking things, because I think you can, if you separate something that's really tight, you get more activity in the stereo or surround spectrum, and I think that's what keeps the listener entertained, as ear candy, let's say. When you don't want just a static mix. It can't just sit there and be all compressed and smushed together. I hear that's kind of a common mistake I hear from people. They just smash everything together, and okay, it might be impressive for a few moments, but then it gets boring. You got to have like sonic movement, and so kind of mixing up the leakage and room mics with things that are more clean or not necessarily clean, but close mic'd and where they stand out, you know. I think that's kind of what I try and do.
Right, right. I like the term sonic movement. Talk a little bit more about that. I know you've talked about the contrast between with the more room and direct or close mic things. Is that also referring to placement of things in the spectrum, things panning, dynamic mixing, or?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, you know, always when I'm first pulling up a mix, besides just kind of figuring out what the problem areas are, that's kind of what I'm looking for when I'm just pulling up faders. I'm also like kind of thinking, okay, the hi-hat's doing this pattern, the acoustic guitar's doing this pattern, or there's a, you know, at this part of the song, the piano's got a right hand, you know, predominant right hand that's like going to like take up the right side. I always pan piano low to high, kind of like as you're sitting in a piano. And I generally have drums panned as though you're a listener.
Okay.
I'll switch it up every now and then. You know, I think some people think of it when you have the hi-hat on the left side as being the drummer at the kit, and it's a bit more alternative. I don't really get that, you know, so much, but sometimes I switch it up because I hear things differently, and it kind of, if I'm stuck on what to do, I'll like switch it up, and it kind of brings up, you know, a different way of putting things together. But I'm looking for ingredients in the record that kind of oppose each other, or where you can hear movement in the stereo, and particularly in surround. I mean, that's really important. I found in doing surround, if you don't create movement, like things like coming at you from the rears, your brain kind of gets immune to the rears, and everything just kind of starts becoming stereo again. So you kind of have to have that sort of sonic movement to like make surround work.
Right, right. So in bringing these different elements out and changing these type things, are you writing a lot of automation for volume to move things up and down, or are you setting the faders and just letting things kind of do it naturally?
Well, the way I approach a mix is to try and get the record to work without rides. I mean, I try and find a way to like, I try to get the record to like get me excited about the song without having to do automation. So once you commit to some automation, then you start getting stuck. And you know, I might just like halfway into the mix decide to change everything all up, you know, and the automation like kind of like restricts you from doing things. So, you know, with working in a DAW, you can actually go in and do clip gain. So you like take sections and you can adjust levels that way. And so, you know, I'll do some of that to try and kind of make things sit in the right place, you know, and that's helped a lot. And then kind of at the last, as I'm like kind of maxing out the mix, as Bowen would always refer to it, you got to max out a record. You know, I do a lot of writing. Yeah, you know, I like go find all the sweet gems that are hidden in there and kind of pull them up. And for me, you know, just growing up on faders, it's easier to do with faders than it is to do with a mouse or to do clip gains. To kind of like, because you have to almost do it in a way that you can predict what the player or the singer's about to do. I mean, having done it so long, I know from what the guitar player's playing that what's coming up next, and I'm ready for that before it happens. Same with the vocal. Right. And that's just from doing it a long time. But to have hands-on faders is really important for me. Right. I use a different platform than most. I use Nuendo or Steinberg. Cubase is essentially the same thing. So I'll use Cubase when they do an update before Nuendo, and then when Nuendo generally follows along, and so then I'll jump to Nuendo because it's got a few more features generally. But I've got the Nuage controller that Yamaha makes for the Steinberg products, and I love that thing. I mean, it's amazing.
So it sounds like there's kind of two stages to a mix for you. There's the going in and doing the clip gain and getting things kind of set for a, I'm going to call it a static mix, but by that I don't mean.
Yeah, no, but that's essentially right. Yeah,
and then you're kind of doing a performance at the end with the
right.
faders to try and
yeah, to liven it up and like I said, max it out. You know,
right?
I mean, the only way to really get a vocal to like sit up on top of the record and yet not be like blowing you away at times, and still sound like it's got that like amazing fidelity, is to do it with rides. I mean, you can compress a vocal and get it to like sit there on top of a record, but then it sounds all like, you know, it just isn't as beautiful as it can be.
Right.
So I mean, I use compression, don't get me wrong. I love compression. I think it's a real tool. It's, for me, was the hardest thing to kind of understand how to use. But so I love compression, I use compression, but I always try and leave room so that I can make the record dynamic or sound dynamic, and not be that thing that just is like,
right.
You know.
Right, right. I could ask questions about this all day long because you're such a font of knowledge on it, but one more that I wanted to ask about. MarkKnopfler has a fairly low-range voice,
yeah.
a pretty deep voice, and it can be a challenge sometimes to get a deeper voice to sit in with all the other musical elements that are in that same frequency range. Do you go in and carve other things out? Do you just push the volumes around, or how do you get him to be so present?
Well, he's got an amazing sounding voice too. I mean, he's got like all that smoky kind of roughness that wraps around the way he sings, you know. And it's gotten lower as time has gone on, and more kind of full-bodied. But I think it's just like one of those really intriguing voices to listen to.
Right.
And I mean, I actually don't mind having it louder than I would have many vocalists, you know, in a record. It sounds commanding, it can be huge. And, you know, part of the thing with making Mark's vocals sit on top of a track is the idea of not putting too much in the record. And also kind of you know, his involvement in the arrangement of the record allows for, you know, things, instruments to not get in the way.
Right.
But yes, there's sculpting, of course. You know, whether it be, you know, changing the instrument itself to kind of like not get in the way. Like, you know, you might start out with a big Dreadnought acoustic guitar that's fairly boomy, but decide, you know, let's either go to maybe a Gibson, you know, smaller body guitar, or go to a high string guitar, or, you know, something that kind of opens up the spectrum a little bit more. So part of it's performance, for sure. I mean, you know, I mean, I'm so lucky to get to work with all these great musicians throughout most of my career, and they're so adapted, like getting out of the way, you know.
Right.
Almost actually, in producing records, these guys in Nashville are so good at like handing off, like, I'll play here, you play there. You know, they don't talk about it, they just do it, and it gets, like I said, it can almost feel a bit factory. So I'll get some guys that maybe aren't so good, or not that they're not good, but that they're maybe not as adept in the studio, and throw them in the mix, and it just kind of slows down the process a little bit, makes people think a little bit more creatively.
Right.
You know,
right.
Yeah, and that's important, you know. I mean, we're supposed to be making something that's unique, and like a snowflake, every record, I think, is different. You can't like kind of put, you can't put an overall EQ that is a formula hit record, or overall compression that is a formula hit compression. You know, it's and there are companies that are trying to do that, right, you know, and man, there's the one that I won't mention names, but it's just the worst thing I've heard in the world,
right?
You know, and they go, so here's some classic records, and this is how they mastered the record back then. So now we have the raw files, the mix before it was mastered, and here's our process on it. You know, which do you prefer? And I go, well, the original. I mean, that's somebody who made decisions that impacted the record, you know.
Right.
You know, yours sounds like all hi-fi and everything, but it doesn't have any character, you know.
Right.
So
right. So that's the trick, right?
I
To
think,
make music
yeah.
with
I mean,
this.
we're doing something creative. While I'm on this rant, you know, it's sort of it's upsetting to me that to see the artistry of engineering and producing kind of being delinquished, whatever, because, you know, anybody can do it now, and anybody can, like, record something, anybody can, like, put together a record and put it out. Anybody. You don't have to have a major label. Nobody's going to approve it. You know, you just put your record out there, and it's, for me, it feels like the bar of quality is dropping and dropping and dropping. I'm not saying that making records that way, that it's not possible to make great records. It is possible, but I think that there are people that dedicate their lives to making records as an engineer or as a producer, and if you have the opportunity to call on their services, you ought to, because they can bring something to a record that one person on their own isn't going to really understand.
Right.
You know, there's a lot of experience in the years that people put into this that kind of make better records.
Right. Right.
And you know, I hate to see it kind of go away in the way that it is.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. There's a lot of food for thought there.
Yeah.
A lot of things to think about.
Yeah.
Chuck, thanks so much for coming in.
You bet, man. This has been awesome.
It's a lot
I've
of fun.
enjoyed this GearFest thing. It's something that everybody ought to experience.
It is something, isn't it?
Yeah,
It's
it's
incredible.
really something else.
We're actually heading in to do a producer discussion panel with some of your peers.
Oh boy, some of the best engineers in the world.
Yeah, it's gonna be fun, isn't it?
Yeah, it's gonna be awesome.
Right
Looking
on.
forward to it.
Yeah, me too. Well, thanks again. I appreciate it. And
Okay,
sharing all
Mitch.
your insights and your knowledge with us here.
You got it.
All right.
Cheers.
And thank you for joining me here at GearFest 2017. I'm Mitch Gallagher.
Chuck Ainlay. See y'all later.